Why is it that I can be in my workplace or at a dinner or in any environment where people with opposing views are, whether religious or political, and listen to one slander those who follow conservative values without even considering that not everyone at the table believes what they believe? I cannot tell you how many conversations I've stood in and vicariously been insulted, called stupid or hateful, uneducated even. How do I live in a nation where not supporting every liberal ideology makes me the one who is judged or me the hateful one? How am I the one who warrants the name calling, the prejudgment, when I don't judge them for their views? I am the one who must withstand the insults of 50% of Americans and 80% of my family. And truly, in many of these moments, I've not chosen to argue. I've walked away saddened at the socially acceptable culture that you can insult a friend or a colleague or just the person on the other side of the table time and time again and cause discomfort purely because you assume that we must all think and surely we all believe the same thing. Yet what I've noticed is that when I sit with a fellow follower of Jesus or a person with conservative values, they do not demean the other side. They purely celebrate their commonality and where they differ. They challenge based on scripture and not just empty name calling. They discern with wisdom of the Holy Spirit and not based on a talking head on their feed. There is a fundamental difference that I've experienced in this country, and in this election cycle, one thing is blatantly clear. A differing mind is not one that is celebrated. I'm going to read to you from Daniel 3, and we'll start in verse 1 through 7. It says, King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold, 60 cubits high and 6 cubits wide, and set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. He then summoned the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials to come to the dedication of the image that he had set up. So the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials assembled for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up, and they stood before it. Then the herald loudly proclaimed, "Nations and peoples of every language, this is what you are commanded to do. As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace." Therefore, as soon as they heard the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, and all kinds of music, all the nations and peoples of every language fell down and worshipped the image of gold, not God, of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So in this chapter, Nebuchadnezzar goes on a quest to create his own giant statue. It had been about 20 years since he had conquered the city and taken Daniel captive. So in the previous chapter, Daniel chapter 2, Daniel and his friends had gained favor from the king, and they were appointed as administrators all over Babylon after God had helped Daniel interpret a dream. God helped Daniel interpret the king's dream that no other sorcerer or witch or astrologist could interpret. So since the king had received Daniel's interpretation of the dream, he knew that Daniel's God had granted him power to rule over the earth, and he believed that his rule was infinite. After his final victory over Israel, he built himself a golden statue. Nebuchadnezzar had not only defeated Israel, but believed that he had defeated every nation that God claimed for himself, including God's very temple on earth where the Jewish people went to worship him. So it's safe to say at this point that Nebuchadnezzar had begun to feel that he had defeated God himself. But as I've said many times before, feelings are terrible leaders. So in the dream from chapter 2, the vision included the statue that was made up of different metals, which represented a nation of opposing views, a melting pot of opinions. Some were strong like iron and some were brittle like clay. A nation that God would rule in the end. But Nebuchadnezzar builds a statue of purely gold. His vision in his way. In reading these passages, you can parallel this to any free nation and any community in this world, because a grouping of people that reflects the world today is really an echo chamber of the same beliefs, the same understanding, or even an aligned perspective, but it should be a melting pot of opposing views, much like the freedom that I've always believed America to have. Yet the Babylonian Empire and America today seem to have much commonality. Nebuchadnezzar believed his rule would never end. He deemed God as irrelevant, inappropriate even for his vision of the nation. He ruled by instilling fear, and many Jews that were in exile, they began to question the promises of God. Because since their temple had been destroyed, now their tradition had to begin of meeting in synagogues, and here was the birth of the modern Jewish practices. There's a verse in Hebrews 10 verse 25, and it says, "Let's not give up meeting together as some are in the habit of doing, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day approaching." This instruction that we see in Hebrews is so pivotal to the church today. All around us, we see the destruction of our city, the state of our school system, the lack of safety in our neighborhoods. There are so many signs that will have you thinking that God has abandoned our city and even our nation. But I want you to hold on to the dream and the interpreter of the dream. There is a reason that God gave them that dream 20 years before, because God was encouraging his people to not give up, to hold on to the promise, to remember who wins in the end. But so many of us forget the last promise that God gave us. And if it hasn't come to pass, then it's too soon to give up. So 20 years later, when the walls fell for the last time and Nebuchadnezzar defeated Israel, they had God's sovereign promise to hold onto. And so came the test. Nebuchadnezzar commanded all the people to worship this golden statue, and he assembled his government to carry out his orders. Sounds kind of familiar. No matter their culture or their beliefs, this image had to be the center of worship for the entire nation, and specifically, they were ordered to bow whenever music was played. And then you wonder why music has control over the minds of generations. It may be for the same reason that anyone would think that Beyonce or Kelly Rowland or Meg Thee Stallion or Cardi B at a political rally represents the voices of the future. In the book of Daniel, King Nebuchadnezzar had no mind to establish any freedom of religious beliefs. He wanted absolute submission. Do you ever feel like you're being ostracized for being a person of faith? Because I do. But this has happened all through the scriptures. Yet the reason it was so easy for so many to worship this golden statue in the book of Daniel is because the people of Babylon were polytheistic. They were used to worshiping many gods. Because if you have a little crystals here and a little tarot card reading here and an occasional sound bath, then what is the actual difference between adding another thing to worship? As humans, we were created to worship. So we will always seek something to worship. Yet that yearning was given to us to find our way back to God. The God that came down from heaven and wrapped himself in flesh and blood to find us. Yet there was a group of friends who would not fail this test. Because even if Nebuchadnezzar was going to throw them into the fire, they would never turn away from their God. Do you have the kind of faith that you are willing to risk your relationships, Or do you believe that God will throw you into a fire and allow you to be burnt? No matter how corrupt the government became, Daniel and his friends had the kind of character that was incorruptible. They didn't even pretend to hide their faith. They could have stood at the statue and not worshipped it, right? They could have been in the environment and been perceived as one of the crowd, and no one would have even have noticed. But we are not called to blend in. We are called to stand out. So the set-apart ones did exactly that, because we can never conceal our worship to our God. So we'll jump back into Daniel 3, verse 19, and it says, Then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude towards them changed. He ordered the furnace 7 times hotter than usual, and commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So these men, wearing their robes, their trousers, their turbans, and other clothes, were bound and thrown into this blazing furnace. The king's command was so urgent and the furnace was so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into a blazing furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar leaped up to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, Weren't there 3 men that were tied up and thrown into the fire? They replied, Certainly, Your Majesty. He said, Look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire. This is so crazy, no matter how many times I read it. They are unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods. Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out! Come here! So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego come out of the fire, and the satraps, prefects, governors, and the royal advisors crowded around them. They saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair of their heads singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. So when we reach the end of this chapter, we come to see that Nebuchadnezzar realizes that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego serve the one true God. Because of their obedience, God is revealed to an entire nation. The character of these 3 men was so strong that the person of Jesus was revealed through them. They didn't need an endorsement or an external character to shine light on who they were. Even though the king commanded Babylon after the fact to worship the one and true God, the God that I know will never force himself on you. He will always be the 4th man in the fire, protecting you from the flames, right next to you in every season and every circumstance. He is a God who is patient and kind, and he will leave the door open, and he will always call you back home to him. And until next time, let's love more, and I'll see you at the next PSA. Woo! It's election week, and it's a fiery one. But just know that no matter the fire that surrounds you, there is a God that is right next to you in every season, protecting you and guiding you. If you enjoyed this message, share it with the first person that comes to mind. We have an entire playlist just for you. We'll see you in the next one.